so much. Delighted to be here for the second session of 2024. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Tamsin Russell. I work at the Museums Association, but today I'm here with my HVG hat on, specifically as co-lead of the Inclusion Working Group. For those of you that may have attended similar sessions that we've run in the past, this is a new session. And it's a new session because of issues that have been sort of fed back to us. And I'll give you some examples of those shortly. But ultimately, our focus historically has been around inclusive recruitment and then also measuring diversity or measuring diversity profiles. What this does really is a session which sort of takes a more helicopter view really around EDI. In terms of what we're going to be doing today, there's a wee bit of a mix between, there will be a breakout session towards the end of the time that we have together. But actually what I'm going to be talking you through is essentially a facilitated individual reflection. So I've got lots of different questions that we will go through, and I'll be asking you to spend a wee bit of time seeing whether you can answer those questions. So if you do have a piece of paper with you, or for those more digitally inclined, a notes function on your phone, feel free to take notes. We won't be doing death by feedback. So this is really me holding the space for you. Some of you might think, oh, I've heard this before. Fantastic. You can then share with us your successes or your challenges. Equally, if you have heard this before, just think of this as a refresher time. I know it's no longer January, but we are in 2024. You know, certainly from my organisation's perspective at the MA and also HVG, our new performance year starts in April. So there's often, I think, sometimes some focus on the new year or some urgency around delivering stuff that you plan to do this year that you've not gotten around. So whatever you are, wherever you are in your inclusion journey, this time is here to meet whatever your needs are ultimately. Lovely to see people introducing themselves in the chat function. So I have got a slide deck, and that's really to keep me right, but also to know that not everybody processes as well through listening, more through looking. So hopefully you can all see a slide that says Heritage Volunteer Group, Creating an Inclusive Culture. We're on Zoom actually, aren't we? I was going to say Teams has been, oh, I'll just stop sharing. Teams has been really petulant with me recently, which is why I've got this slight view as opposed to anything else. But can everyone see? Wonderful. Okay. So what are we going to be doing today? We're going to be answering these three questions. So what do we mean by culture? What do we mean by an inclusive culture? What's the difference around that? I'm then going to do and provide that time for you to do some reflection about, well, how does your organisation measure up? Okay, so I've got some questions to support that particular section. And then we're going to talk about starting your journey. And that's when we'll do a little bit of the sort of breakout groups. And it says questions and answers at the end. That's really just to highlight that this is an interactive session. But as Rhiannon said, don't feel you have to hold a question in your head. Feel free to put it into the chat function if you wish. And so it's there, and we will come to that at that point. So I just wanted to highlight, I suppose, the legislative landscape around inclusivity. This is one of my favourite pieces of legislation. I can bore you at length around this, but this was really transformative legislation when it was introduced in 2010, and it came as a result of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, ultimately, the Macpherson inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and the concept of institutional racism and then institutional discrimination, primarily within the public sector. So for those of you that work for local authority museums or are nationally styled or work for national museums, if you're in Wales, England, and Scotland, you are covered by this legislation. And this legislation identifies three aspects. One, around eliminating unlawful discrimination. Two, around advancing equality of opportunity between people. And three, fostering good relationships between people who share a protected characteristics and those that don't. In the majority of organisations, I would suggest the focus is on the first bullet point there, eliminate unlawful discrimination. So when we often think about equality and inclusion, it's often around addressing that particular aspect. And certainly within an HR setting, often that aspect is a function of recruitment and selection. The Equality Act has identified 9 protected groups that have particular protection as a function of the legislation. I'm not going to read them out at the moment, but I can certainly answer those questions shortly. And also as part of this legislation, it highlights the role that organisations might have as a policymaker, a service provider, and an employer. And of course, I've just put a little asterisk there because I'm talking about employment in the broader sense, but the people processes around that. Okay. Why am I highlighting this? I'm highlighting this because you may well be in an organisation that is very focused on legal compliance. And when you are trying to create an inclusive culture, one of the easiest ways to do so is to work on what's important for your organisation. So if your organisation is absolutely bound up in compliance and making sure that everything is legal, which I hope they would, but this might be the influencer that you need if you're trying to engage and get people on your side. There are, of course, other aspects around inclusive culture. So we've already talked about legal, but let's just talk about the ethical component. So ethics as standards of behaviour or practice exist as a collective understanding within societies, or in this particular case, within particular sectors or subsectors. As you can imagine, I work for the Museums Association. So what I've highlighted here is the Museums Association Code of Ethics that talks explicitly around meaningful participation, transparent working practices. The list goes on. Depending on where you're working, so you might be working in a zoo or you might be working in a national park, what you might find is there are specific codes of conduct or codes of ethics in your own subsector. So I, again, would really advise that you seek those out to enable you to utilise whatever is the accepted collective standard of ethical behaviour in your influencing and in your conversations. It could be as minimum as signposting this to your own volunteers, for example. The moral argument around inclusivity and inclusive cultures very much sits at an individual level. And often we find that people perhaps conflate the concept of morals and ethics. They're very different. So moral is at an individual level. So within this space, I can't see how many people we've got, but let's imagine we've got 12 different individuals. We might all be embarking on our own professional practice from 12 different moral standpoints. We all have our own compass around what is important to you. And I'm using the word moral, but you might want to use the word values or beliefs, principles, that they can to a greater degree be interchangeable at an individual level. And then the other sort of landscape driver for inclusive practice, apart from us being human beings, is around business benefits. So again, the reason I highlight this is if you're working for a commercial organisation that's very market driven, then actually what you might use to influence the conversation and commitment to inclusive cultures might be around revenue generation, so the concept of the pink pound. You know, if we do this, we're going to attract this different group of people and they're going to spend this money. It might be around the evidence, which is very clearly in place around having more diverse workforces leads to greater innovation and performance. It could be from a business perspective that your argument around creating a more inclusive culture is around the concept of reputation and profile. So what I've tried to do in the first couple of slides is just get you to acknowledge that there are a variety of things that exist already that you can utilize to enable you to create an inclusive culture in your organization, but also to enable you to influence that by understanding actually what is your culture like already. So this is a new workshop, as I've highlighted, and the reason we've put this one in place is that we had feedback from some of our inclusion forums that there were particular issues that were around organisational culture. So often when we're thinking around inclusivity, as I've already highlighted, a bit of repetition here, the focus tends to be on the recruitment and selection side, the appointment side. How do we attract the biggest field of candidates? How do we make sure that individuals apply to be volunteers within our organisation? And if this is something you're really interested in, we run a whole dedicated workshop to this entirely. But what we know from feedback is there are lots of other things sort of bubbling along. You can, as a volunteer coordinator, volunteer manager, whatever your title, put in place a range of things to increase inclusive recruitment and inclusive selection. But actually, there are other things that might be happening within your organisation that you need to be mindful of. So we've had a few examples from our discussions at the inclusion forums around, I suppose, sort of more, not performance issues in terms of whether you can do your job or not, but things that sort of happen on a day-to-day basis. And so some of the things that have come up in our discussions have been around, you know, situations or examples where volunteers have been misgendering other volunteers within an organisation. We've had examples of volunteers using racial slurs as part of their talks, and also as part of their conversations in the team room or the tea room, whatever it might be. We've had examples of volunteer coordinators and supervisors not wanting to advertise because, you know, they know who they want and they know who that group is. So there's a whole raft of different things that we might want to explore as part of sort of inclusive cultures. And to do that, ultimately, we need to move away from that recruitment and selection aspect, which is just one tiny element of our experience of work, and let's take a helicopter view to say, let's look at the life cycle of a volunteer within my organisation. What does that mean in terms of their experience of my organisation as a volunteer? So what do we mean by culture in general? It's not a test, by the way, it's not a pub quiz. I always go to look to see what does the dictionary say. So when we talk about culture more broadly, it's ideas, customs, social behaviour of a particular people or society. In an organisational setting, though, we have a slightly different definition. So it's a set of values, beliefs, attitudes, systems. I love that systems word, and rules that outline and influence. And in this particular situation, the term, as I've lifted it, is employee behaviour, but ultimately it's, you know, it's a broader workforce behaviour. I'll update my slides around that. So within your organisation, you will have a sense of what the culture of the organisation is. But what we also know around organisations, especially larger organisations, is that you'll have the overarching organisational culture here. But if you can imagine you've got 5 other functions or 5 teams, it's quite likely, in addition to this overarching culture, we then also have little subcultures that exist. So you might be sitting in an organisation and in a team or in a function that is absolutely on board around everything to do with inclusive practice. And actually the whole organisation and organisational level might be on board around inclusive practice, but one of the other departments or functions you work with just isn't on board. So that's an example of a subculture. So you might see other teams, departments or functions that are just not keeping up with the pace or the culture of organizations. You might describe them as being resistant or more traditional. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but basically there are subcultures that might exist within an organization that could be pro-inclusion, but equally could be anti-inclusion. And obviously we could drill down even further. You know, if you're thinking about the different volunteer programs that you run or the different volunteer groups that you run, there might be subcultures. You know, it carries on going down in terms of people's support around inclusion specifically. I want to introduce you to a guy called Edgar Schein, who has written extensively around organizational culture. And he talks about an organizational onion. This is where I would really love to have an onion that I could show you, but I don't. But his organizational onion identifies that there are different layers of culture that we see or experience. And he's identified core beliefs at the heart of the organization, artifacts, which basically mean things that you can physically see or touch. Like, so for example, a policy would be classed as an artifact. And then behaviors. So this is what you would see from delivering from people. The behaviors might also be around decision making, you know, it's actually what you see physically. And here is a lovely representation of Edgar's onion here. So you've got things right at the heart of the organisation, and as you go out, you see other things. Why am I highlighting this? I'm highlighting this because sometimes this is where a disconnect happens. Okay, so you might find that the organisation says very clearly, these are our values, but the procedures or the behaviours that exist, those artefacts or behaviours, those policies or behaviours, don't support the core belief of that organisation. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you're ever in an organisation thinking this is tokenistic, this is this is a bit there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. It's often because these different things aren't aligned. Okay, so you might find you've even got a policy, but actually no one adheres to it. The behaviours are a bit flawed. Two other terms I think are important to note when we're talking about inclusive cultures are the concept of climate. So you'll have an overarching organisational culture, but the climate is a temporary state, and so it fluctuates. So you often hear people talk about in the current climate. So it could be in the current climate, financial precarity, in the current climate, Black Lives Matter. Okay, so what you might find also is that the culture of the organisation changes a little bit depending on what's going on outside. So it's slightly more responsive. And then the other aspect of climate when we're talking about organisational culture is also a little bit more around how people experience it. Okay, and that's really important when we're talking about inclusion, because actually my experience of an organisational culture might be very different from somebody else's experience. I'm not going to talk about typologies of culture, you'll be pleased to know, but I do think it's helpful for you to get a sense of the type of organisation that you work in. You know, so are they really hierarchical, i.e. you have to use the hierarchies, you can't step out of line, they're very process driven? Or are they very competitive? So, you know, are they very focused on, you know, we'll do whatever we need to do to generate revenue or to get more visitors or whatever it might be. It might be more of a sort of a commercial aspect. It could be far more collegiate and collaborative. That's what the clan typology is. Or it could be more innovative, which is what the adhocracy is, where you've got sort of opportunities to be more innovative, more autonomous. Why am I asking you to think about this? To understand what your current organisational culture is enables you then to work within it for your best approach. So I think often when I have conversations with people and they're like, oh my goodness, there's loads of barriers, we have to go through so many hoops. Do you know what? I get it. So use that to your advantage. if you're working in a really hierarchical organization, there will be a procedure, I guarantee, that enables you to bring things to the top. And there will be an opportunity to go to the person and the person above and CC them in an email because they're so hierarchical. So understanding your organization's culture can actually then enable you to work out how you're going to try and influence change within it. So what do we mean by inclusive cultures? And then I'll hand over to you in a moment just to start thinking around your own organizations. So, well, first of all, how do we define inclusion? So inclusion is the action or state of including or of being included within a group or structure. Another definition of inclusion is around practice and policy, providing equal access, although terminology now has sort of moved from equal to equitable access to opportunities. So understanding, again, if you're thinking about how can I create an inclusive culture in my organization, or how can I create an inclusive subculture within my team, identifying what you understand by inclusion or what your organization understands by inclusion can be really, really helpful so that you're all working and progressing in the same, I suppose, in the same image and with the same understanding. So an inclusive culture is one that embraces and celebrates all of our differences in experience, backgrounds, ways of thinking. And again, often when we think around inclusion, the default position is to think around those 9 protected groups that I highlighted that are protected by law. But of course, diversity is much broader than those nine groups. Diversity comes in, shocker, a whole range of shapes and sizes that go beyond the structures around legislation. So again, you know, as part of you identifying what does an inclusive culture or subculture look like, what does that mean for you? You know, so from a Museums Association perspective, with my little MA hat on, we have a really broad definition of inclusion to include a sense of belonging, a sense of being valued and being seen, ultimately. And we include things like rural versus metropolitan, extrovert versus introvert, neither of which class, socioeconomic, financial attainment, educational attainment, none of those things are protected by law, but all of those things are aspects of diversity and therefore aspects that we would like to focus on from an inclusion perspective. And so what does inclusive volunteering culture mean? Well, it relates to this commitment, the policies, the practices, the experiences, and the experiences of the volunteers in the sector. So that's I suppose, my starter for 20 minutes rather than a starter for 10. And now what I want to do is hold some space for you to do some individual reflection. And as I've said, I'm not going to get you to feed this back, but I'm going to give you sort of 4 questions and some time for you to reflect, and I'll put myself on mute. So in terms of, we know what a culture is and the different nuances of that. We've talked a little bit about what inclusion is and what that might mean for your own organisation as well. I now want you to spend some time reflecting on how does your organisation measure up to that? You know, so look at your organisations, and I appreciate we're all sitting in different organisations, okay? But look at your organisation's vision, go on their website if they have one, or if you can remember it off by heart. Think about it. So think about your organization's vision if they have one, mission if they have one, values if they have one, strategic priorities or themes or aims, the terminology changes. But to what extent is inclusivity represented in any of those aspects of your strategic framework? Does that make sense? So you might want to Google, you might want to remember, you want to quickly go through your organisation's annual report or corporate plan. I don't care what it is. But I just want you to spend a wee bit of time thinking about, does inclusivity, is it represented in any of these aspects? Okay, so I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that, and then we're going to come back as a group. Don't worry if you haven't had a chance to go through all of those. That was just 4.5 minutes, so I've cut a little bit off that time. Let me show you one I've prepared earlier. Bear with me. So this is the HVG strategic framework. So what I've done is I've looked at our vision. So our vision is transformative volunteering across the heritage sector. No explicit concept of inclusion in that vision. Our mission is enabling the heritage sector to realise the potential of volunteering and transform organisations' lives and communities. Again, no explicit. Maybe if we had the word of all, might be more inclusive, but I'm not going to change it now. But if we look at our values, we've got 5 values that support our work and direct our work. And you can see very clearly, because I put it in bold, inclusive, okay? So what I can see already from an organisational commitment perspective, I can see an explicit commitment to inclusion. What that enables me to do is to use that in all of my influencing. Every time I'm trying to get somebody on board to think around inclusion differently, I can say, in line with our organisational values, we have identified that we want to champion diverse expertise and equitable participation. And I can use this to support my argument. And when everyone says to me, well, why are you doing that? Why are you bothering with that? I can say, because of course, as you know, it's one of our strategic values, and this is why I'm doing it. So key message 1, understanding your organisation's explicit commitment to inclusion can really help you influence. I've just given you that example. But equally, key message 2 is understanding your organisation's explicit commitment to an inclusion can also help you attract a sort of more diverse volunteer base, because people feel as if it's going to be more tolerant or supportive environment. They might get a greater sense of belonging within the organisation. So back to you, some more questions for you to think about. Some more individual reflection time. So again, we're still thinking about how does your organisation measure up? So you are not going to get to the bottom of all of these, but I want you to just to think about, you know, what does your organisation within its own strategy have a dedicated section, or does it have a dedicated strategy around equality, inclusion and diversity? Does your organisation have a dedicated policy around EDI? Are there any procedures or practices that you're aware of that your organisation has that would support the creation of an inclusive culture? Are there any measures, you know, that old adage, what gets measured gets done? I think I meant to say it in a Yorkshire accent. But you know, is there anything that exists within your organisation that they need to measure? Is there a target? Is there a metric? What about your funders? So again, I just want you to reflect based on your current knowledge of your organisation, or if you want to do some Googling on your intranet or the internet, feel free to do so. But I'm just going to stop speaking for a wee bit and give you just a couple of minutes for you to reflect on these aspects. So I'll bring you back shortly, and then we'll move on to a breakout session. so it's another 4.5 minutes. And here's one I prepared earlier. So I've not looked at all of this. So the HVG doesn't have a dedicated strategy for EDI, but we might be in the near future. We don't have currently a policy. We're a very new organisation around EDI. It's on the agenda to write, but we do have some procedures and practices in place. So, oh gosh, bear with me. So we have this workshop. We have a workshop for our staff around inclusive recruitment, and we adopt inclusive recruitment practices. We have a workshop that we deliver to our members around measuring diversity. We have an inclusion forum for our members and our board to have conversation around inclusion. We have a resource pack. We have the inclusion working group that prioritises all of this work. So we have the explicit value of inclusive work, and then we have all of this that you can then physically see. So this will be classed as Edgar's artifact, but also experience in terms of our behaviours. So I've already talked about key message 1 and key message 2, but key message 3, understanding what your organisation already has in place, can really help you to start or work out what you need to do to hone good practice in your organisation. That's really, really key. So I'm going to get you now to do a breakout, and my lovely assistant is going to put you into a breakout for about 10 minutes. And as part of this, I want you to reflect on these questions. And it can be about having a conversation about how confident you feel or how knowledgeable you feel or what your experiences are today. But in your groups, based on what we've talked about, what does this mean in terms of what do you need to develop? Do you need to develop processes or policies? Do you need to develop knowledge about protected groups? Do you have any questions that you need to ask either of HVG and other people here or of your organisation? And also begin in your small groups of 3 just to discuss who else is there to help you. You've got 10 minutes to talk about everything that we've covered. And then we'll come back and I'll give you some other hints and tips, and then we'll deal with some questions. Okay, so over to you and into your groups. Hi, everybody. Everyone's just sort of shuffling back in. Brilliant. Rhiannon, is everyone sort of nearly in? They're in. Thank you for that thumbs up. Thank you for, I wasn't in your conversations. I hope they were meaningful and rich and exciting. And you might be thinking, oh, this isn't what I hoped. I hoped that Tamsin would be here with a magic wand to create an inclusive culture for my organisation. No, unfortunately not. Also, this isn't tactical, even though I've given you some, I suppose, some steps to go through. What I've done ultimately here is to ring fence some time to think around essentially your organizational context and its strategic commitment to inclusion. And my thought process here is, if you understand what your organization stands for, you can then use that to your advantage to affect change. If you understand the context of your organization in terms of what you have or what you don't have, it enables you to use what you do have, but also flag what you don't have that needs to be developed over time. But in terms of starting your journey, part of all of this is around you feeling comfortable and confident and being equipped to be able to have these conversations. So I have got a couple of other slides that I do want to share, and the slide deck will be made available, and ultimately you can work through that at your leisure around this. And remember, this is just one of 3 workshops that we do. So the other 2 are more tactical. But I think putting in your thinking around this to begin with is always time well invested. But before I do sort of carry on sharing my slides, I'm just going to sort of open it up just to see if anyone has got any sort of burning questions or reflections around anything that we've covered. Is there a live issue? And what I would highlight is our inclusion forum between...
Are there some more somewhere?
Sorry? Maybe somebody's put themselves off mute, I don't know. So does anyone have a question around anything that we've covered? or a question about their own organisation?
I did have one.
Yes, go for it.
We discussed in our group. Well, the two things that we came up with is we have very good internal procedure, like for staff, in terms of we've got a whole EDI forum. We have a monthly update newsletter that comes out, but I don't know how much of that is then filtered out to volunteers. I think that's the thing, because we don't always see what goes out to volunteers. So although we think we're very well set up on a website, I don't think it's really explicit. So that's one issue. But the issue I have, not issue, but the thing that it does make me think about is I work for the Alzheimer's Society.
Mm-hmm.
And my role is to match up volunteers with service users, and they do activities. So it's to keep the service user active, to use their brain and slow down, hopefully, progression of dementia. So it's a great idea. And without generalising, we do have a few early onset dementia people, but the vast majority of our service users would probably be older people. And the issue potentially you've had in a couple of situations is they have some quite fixed views over the sort of people they might be matched with. So they could come over as quite, I guess, offensive without meaning to. If they're, I can't understand you. If it's somebody who's not British, for example, and they're speaking with an accent, they might, they could cause offence, or the language they might use for somebody who's gay might be the old-fashioned. And it how that could, if we're trying to promote the inclusivity of all types of people, and we're matching them with people, we as a society want them to be, inclusive. But you can't change somebody's lifelong views over something. Do you see what I mean? And it's how that sits within what's so important to us as a charity, but then what we're actually trying to do in the practicality. So just be curious to know if you've had any experience of this sort of situation.
I haven't, but I think, for me, it's really clear cut. Your organisation has got a really clear direction of travel. It wants to be inclusive, but the particular service user group that it delivers services to from the clinical reason of aging, a lack of filter potentially that might be associated with dementia, cognitive decline, processing speeds, all of those things mean that the likelihood is that people may have more fixed thinking. And actually, you're not going to change them, and you wouldn't be able to, and you perhaps shouldn't anyway. That's who they are. That's their viewpoint. What you might want to do is just make sure that the processes and the support mechanisms in place for all of your volunteers are robust, and that they know what they're going into, but they know what your point is, and also probably what your line is, that maybe there is a line at which there would be an issue that you might need to intervene, but also so there's a procedure if anyone does want to make a complaint. So it's about really being as transparent with your volunteers coming in. This is just the reality of this particular service group, and it's beyond our control and their control to make any amends. But what our commitment to you is we want to create a safe space as possible. We're here to listen to you. We'll take your views seriously. If for whatever reason you feel that you can't continue with that relationship, we'll see if we can find another volunteering relationship, etc. I think that's all you would be able to do.
No, that's interesting. Thank you.
And I just think in terms of often EDI is really well established for staff, but isn't necessarily always really well established for volunteers. All you need to do is go back and just say, can we add volunteers to all the policies? Just, sometimes it's as easy as that, staff and volunteers. And if we're sending things out, is there, just highlight the bits that go out to volunteers as opposed to anybody else, so they have that sense of belonging. Any other questions or reflections? Obviously, our inclusion forum, which happens every month between 4:15 and 4:45, enables you to bring live issues and questions to a hive mind of different people. So I'm just going to go through some last two slides before I hand it over, just so you can see what you're going to get when you get this pack. So you've just done that little breakout and an exchange with different people. That is you starting your journey. So beginning to have conversations about your competence levels and what you need and what are some of the issues, etc. And I think sometimes it's really helpful to talk to others about it, so you're not only having a conversation with yourself. Other things that you might want to do, and I'm going to share this with you shortly, is to reflect on the stakeholders internally and externally and map them. This is a very sort of straightforward model about understanding power and interest. You might also want to explore what are the blocks and barriers within your organisation. Can they be easily addressed? What do you need? What needs to be addressed to address something else? So is there a critical path? What are you going to have to accept? Like, so we've just had that brilliant, Charlotte. You know, we've had to accept that that group of people may well not be as inclusive as we would like our staff or volunteers to be, but there is nothing we can do about that. And that's an accepted risk. And we just have to make sure that we mitigate the experience of that risk rather than remove the risk, because we can't remove the risk because they're our service users, you know. So having those sort of conversations. You might also, as I've highlighted already, want to reflect on an entire process flow. So at what point is there exclusionary practice or the potential for exclusionary practice? And then I would be suggesting 6 months action plan. Let's not think too far ahead. Let's just keep it tight. What does that mean for 6 months? And again, these are just some of the questions that you might want to think about. So that brings me to the end, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon with 1 minute to spare. Thank you very much.
Brilliantly done, Tamsin. Thank you so much for that session. I hope you all have got lots of food for thought. I've popped the link in the chat, so 4:15 we'll be back here on the new link for the Inclusion Forum even. If you haven't been to one before, they're really, really informal. They are as good as the conundrums and the challenges we all bring to the sessions. So really recommend those if you'd like to keep the conversation going. Other than that, we'll be back in March. The exact date, TBC, but I will be confirming that with everyone as soon as possible. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll hope to see you either in 15 minutes or back here next month. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
And thank you to Tamsin, and have a great holiday, Tamsin.